which endure come from the soul of the people. The mighty in their pride walk alone to destruction. The humble walk hand in hand with Providence to immortality.
On August 2, 1923, 3 years into his presidency, Warren G. Harding died of a heart attack in his hotel room. His death was relatively sudden and shocked his inner circle. Harding's doctor had declared the president recovered from illness mere days before. Though America mourned his death, the federal government felt a certain kind of relief at his passing. Harding's administration had been full of corruption. Members of his cabinet were accused of taking bribes, and the president himself had several affairs while he was in office. Harding's VP, however, was comparatively free of scandal. Vice President Calvin Coolidge, 51, was a fairly well-known man in politics, popular among his constituents for his adherence to the principle of civility. When Harding passed in August of 1923, Coolidge was vacationing at his childhood home with his wife and father. The news reached them in the late hours of the evening when no federal officials could be contacted. Thus, with a sense of urgency for the American people, Coolidge had his own father administer the presidential oath. At 2:47 a.m. on August 3, 1923, Calvin Coolidge became the first and only president to be sworn in by a relative. President Coolidge had many nicknames during his time in office. He was known for his withdrawn, careful demeanor, which earned him titles such as Cool Cal and Cautious Cal. His most common epithet, and arguably the most ironic, was Silent Cal. Despite his penchant for public speaking, Coolidge was known to be a quiet man in private, and his peers joked that he was silent in 5 languages. Many historians argue that his inclination towards silence was purposeful, something he cultivated in order to create a specific public image. Coolidge himself once said that the words of the president have an enormous weight and ought not to be used indiscriminately, which could indicate that his silence was pointed, rather than a simple personality trait. Regardless of the origins of the nickname, the irony of Silent Cal was obvious. Calvin Coolidge was the first president to have his own inauguration broadcast over the radio, and the last president to write all his own speeches, of which he gave 135 during his administration. He was known as a skilled orator and utilized his abilities in his frequent public addresses. Thus, though he was a quiet man in private, he was a public figure, and his words were far more accessible to working-class Americans than any other president before him. This relationship with more modern media made Coolidge unique in comparison to his predecessors. Although he was not the first president to make a phone call, that record goes to Rutherford B. Hayes, or the first president to appear on film, that was Grover Cleveland and William McKinley, Coolidge's extensive use of the radio gave him a much larger audience than the other more famous presidents before him. By the time Coolidge was in office, many Americans owned a radio or had partial access to one. His inaugural address, the first presidential speech broadcast on the radio, had an estimated 22.8 million listeners, 20% of the American population at the time. He gave multiple speeches over the phone, including one of his most famous addresses titled Discriminating Benevolence. His inauguration in 1925 was filmed, and commentary on the event was available through newspapers and radio stations alike. Ultimately, the widespread reach of Coolidge's speeches made him accessible to the American public in a way no other president had been before. In this way, Coolidge was somewhat of a revolutionary. He introduced the American public to the idea of an accessible president and set a precedent of more open interaction between the government and the people. His willingness to embrace modern media permanently changed the standards of the presidential office and shaped how presidents would communicate with the public for years to come. In Coolidge's time, he was the radio president, and the use of widespread broadcasting was somewhat of a trademark of his administration. However, Coolidge was limited by his situation. Radio was still relatively novel, and he was already establishing a new tradition by using it. He did not go out of his way to establish any more. By today's standards, his administration was decently unremarkable. Most historians don't place him among the higher tiers of U.S. presidents, and the records he set in office are glazed over in favor of heavy hitters like FDR and Reagan. However, it's important to acknowledge the contributions Coolidge made to the American standards of presidential communication and the lasting impacts he had on the government's usage of modern media. In the short term, it's fairly easy to see the impacts of Coolidge's persona. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president after Coolidge's successor, Herbert Hoover, was well known for his public image. FDR established his own tradition of fireside chats, radio broadcasts that placed him solidly in the public eye. While Coolidge began the use of presidential radio broadcasting, it has been argued that Roosevelt perfected it. In his fireside chats, FDR spoke more casually and directly to the American people than other presidents traditionally did. Thus, the legacy of the radio president became Roosevelt's, and the accessibility of the presidential office is more often credited to him. And nonetheless, it is impossible to deny that Calvin Coolidge paved the way for Roosevelt's fireside chats, and that without Coolidge's legacy, Roosevelt would not have been able to put himself forward in the way he did. The long-term impact of Coolidge's use of radio is more difficult to denotate. After all, the usage of media and technology by the presidential office has evolved far past Coolidge's broadcasts. Today, nearly every politician has a social media account. Speeches by the president are uploaded to YouTube. Live congressional proceedings are accessible to anyone with a device that can connect to the internet. Americans can not only send a letter to the president, they can message him with a single tap of a button. Today, the president can be considered as much a celebrity as a politician, and politics are more public than they ever were. Communication between a president and the American people can be instantaneous. Donald Trump's infamous use of Twitter is one example of the oversaturated publicizing of a politician. The question still stands. How did Calvin Coolidge's simple inaugural address contribute to today's presidential publicity? It boils down to communication. President Coolidge opened a new line of communication between the government and the people when he broadcasted his first speech on the radio. He cultivated the relationship between a president and the public, and in doing so, he paved the way for the politics and presidential communication of today.
Burdens have been great, but the strength to bear them has been greater. The condition of those who toil is higher, better, more secure than in all the ages past.